Mr. President, I rise today to oppose Colin Kahl's nomination for Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and I advise my colleagues to do the same as we are getting ready to take a vote on this very important position in the Pentagon that, to me, is one of the most important positions we have at the Department of Defense. While I have many policy disagreements with Dr. Kahl, which I've discussed at length with him, I want to say I have a long history of working across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, on defense issues, even with those who I don't agree with their policies on. Matter of fact, the presiding officer and I have a very strong working relationship, and we don't agree on a lot of issues, but particularly on issues of the military. I serve on the Armed Services Committee. I take these matters very seriously. They're one of the main reasons I ran for the U.S. Senate 6.5 years ago. And I focus a lot on the military personnel, uniform and civilian, that we put in the Pentagon that have this enormous responsibility to oversee the Department of Defense. And whether it's assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, admirals, generals, I try to understand where they're coming from. And I have a record of strongly supporting almost all of them, whether in the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and even in the Biden administration. For example, I not only supported the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, knowing that I wasn't going to agree with him on everything. I actually introduced him at his confirmation hearing because I served with him in the military a number of years ago. And I know he's a man of honor and character. I strongly supported the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kath Hicks, given her background and knowledge. But some nominees I have not and I will not support, particularly in this area that's so important to our nation's defense. I will object to these people because, like Dr. Kahl, I don't believe he has the temperament or judgment to do the job. And like I said, Mr. President, I have looked at and focused on dozens and dozens of members who need Senate confirmation in the Department of Defense, their temperament and judgment. The vast, vast majority, Democrat or Republican, I've supported. But not this one. And this is a really important position. The Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is essentially the number 3 position in the Pentagon. And as I mentioned, it's my view, and I believe most of my colleagues' view, at least on this side of the aisle, that Dr. Kahl does not have the temperament or judgment. And in fact, I believe that he has potential to be a liability to our national security and our defense, and not to be viewed favorably by the men and women he is supposed to lead. Let me talk about temperament, Mr. President, and a little bit of background. Not even a year ago, a number of Senate Democrats, my colleagues, wrote the official who was nominated by the Trump administration for this same position, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Brigadier General Anthony Tata. And the letter, which was signed by a number of my Senate Democrat colleagues, many of whom are on the Armed Services Committee, focused on that nominee's record of, quote, offensive and inflammatory comments, which would disqualify you from serving in your current position in the position for which you have been nominated. That's one of the quotes. Remember, same position, Trump administration. This letter also said that he had made inflammatory remarks regarding the president, that would be President Obama, and inflammatory remarks regarding rhetoric for members of Congress as well. Again, that was last year. This is the standard that was being used. This letter goes on to say, your multiple past statements cannot be dismissed as simple an aberration. So I mentioned this letter, Mr. President, and I'd like to submit it for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Because you have almost the identical situation here. What happened with General Tata is that his nomination, for a lot of these reasons, was withdrawn by the Trump administration. But now, when you have the same, almost identical issues with this nominee, when I've showed this letter to my Democratic colleagues, they're like, oh, no, that's okay. It's not okay. It's not okay. So let's talk about temperament. Tweets. Dr. Kahl has been really, the issue here is he more of a political hack who's tweeting all the time? He tweets quite a lot. Or in somebody with the temperament of a partisan internet troll? Or is he a measured national security professional who can lead the Pentagon in the number 3 position? Unfortunately, I think it's the former issue, not the latter. He's got a long history of tweets. And just like the issues that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle objected to last year for this same position for the Trump administration's nominee, who was withdrawn for these reasons, here's just a small example of Dr. Kahl's tweets. Same issues that my colleagues were concerned about. A lot of attacks on members of Congress. Okay, that's fine. We're in the public arena. Here's what he said. The GOP used to pride itself as a party that put values front and center in U.S. foreign policy. He tweeted, now they are the party of ethnic cleansing. Okay, I don't think we're the party of ethnic cleansing. It's pretty strong stuff. He's tweeting more. Let's not mince words. The Trump administration kidnapped children. The Republican Party, in terms of national security, are now part of a, quote, death cult. He retweeted the now discredited Lincoln Project attacks. I know a lot about them. Spent a lot of money in my race. Very discredited group of people, by the way. Very disturbed, some of their leaders, the Lincoln Project. He called in tweets the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, a moron, repugnant, a coward. He went on to call my colleagues in the Senate many additional things that I won't repeat here. He did this a lot, Mr. President. No matter what your views of members of my colleagues or the former president, words matter, attacks matter. And if you can't refrain from making them, maybe you don't belong in the number 3 position in the Pentagon. That was the conclusion that pretty much everybody made last year. So why shouldn't that be different with this candidate? It shouldn't be different. Don't get me wrong. It's a free country. You're allowed to tweet and criticize the Commander-in-Chief and members of Congress all the time. That's fine. That's what America is. That's what democracy is. But that doesn't mean you get a free pass to be the number 3 guy at the U.S. Department of Defense, which is what he wants. So that's temperament. And I don't think it's a good temperament to lead the Pentagon at all. Let's talk about judgment, especially policy judgment. You know, the questions of temperament are often closely aligned with, but they're not the same as judgment, particularly as it relates to policies. Judgment is being able to assess a situation, use history as a guide, and take appropriate action. And I think this nominee lacks judgment. Something that was shown when he was then Vice President Biden's National Security Advisor. Let me provide a few examples. First, as many know, he was a staunch advocate for the Iran nuclear deal. And I believe an advocate on being soft on Iran. By the way, it's not always said in public, but a bipartisan majority of U.S. senators and a bipartisan majority of members of the House all oppose the Iran deal. All oppose the Iran deal. But in my view, Mr. President, appeasing the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, leaders with blood of thousands of American troops on their hands, these terrorists, is not smart policy judgment. And Dr. Kahl doesn't seem to know when we can press the Iranians. And this is a really big issue. Every time someone tried to press them, draw a red line, take aggressive action, he criticized it. Dr. Kahl in 2015 argued for sanctions relief on Iran, claiming that the vast majority of the relief would go to butter, not guns. Well, we know how that turned out. That money went to arming terrorists and the continuation of Iran's proxies around the Middle East and around the world committing terrorism. Dr. Kahl said pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal was, quote, a dangerous delusion. He said, quote, the hawks in Congress, and I think he meant that as an insult. By the way, I view that not as an insult, particularly after the Obama-Biden administration cut defense spending by 25% and drastically reduced readiness. But the hawks in Congress who supporting pulling out of the Iran deal, quote, won't be satisfied until they get the war they've pushed for decades, unquote. Really? I didn't want war with Iran. Those who opposed the JCPOA, again, bipartisan majority of U.S. senators, we didn't want a war with Iran. We just thought the JCPOA was misguided. After the U.S. strike that killed Iranian terror commando Qasem Soleimani, Kahl tweeted the following, quote, Trump has started a war with Iran in Iraq. Really? I think what the president and our fine military did when they killed General Soleimani was reestablish deterrence, which we had lost in the Middle East when this terrorist killed thousands and wounded thousands of U.S. servicemen and women and never had to pay consequences. We reestablished a red line saying, you kill Americans, you're going to pay. And guess what? That war never happened, although Kahl predicted it. And even Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Zarif, acknowledged in these tapes that we've been talking about here on the Senate floor that the killing of Soleimani, quote, was when the United States delivered a major blow to Iran, more damaging than if it had wiped out an entire city in an attack. That's the foreign minister of Iran, knowing what we did was very significant. Dr. Kahl, if you look at his tweets, wouldn't have done that because he thought it would have, quote, brought the war that the hawks want. We don't want a war. And we didn't get a war. He, just like John Kerry, who is now being accused of leaking secrets that Israel had, one of our most important allies, to Iran, one of our, not one, the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, I believe is soft on Iran. We're going to get to the bottom of the Kerry issue, by the way. It's alleged what he did, but if he did it, if he sold out Israel for Iran, he needs to resign and be fired. We're going to get to the bottom of that. Mr. President, let me mention one other issue. It's a sensitive one, I admit it, but I think it's also an important one with Dr. Kahl. At his confirmation hearing, he said one of his priorities is to, quote, stamp out, quote, systemic racism within the ranks of the military. Now, look, I care about this issue if we have, and every organization has bad people in it. I spoke on the Senate floor last year about some of these issues. I put forward legislation last year in the NDAA that looks at why aren't we having promotions of African Americans at higher ranks, at the highest ranks of the military. It's an issue I care about. But when he said this in his confirmation hearing, systemic racism within the ranks, I was very curious. Have you served in the ranks, maybe? No, he hasn't. I have, 26 years, still serving. Where did he get the information? That's a broad statement to make about our troops that you want to lead. During the hearing, Dr. Kahl admitted he had, quote, no credible evidence to back up that kind of statement. Well, that's a real lack of judgment. You're besmirching a big portion of the force with no credible data to back it up, and you want to be the number 3 leader in the Pentagon. This is judgment, Mr. President. And this is one of the many reasons I'm going to vote against him, and I hope that my colleagues do. Let me end with one final thing. Dr. Kahl made a statement in his confirmation here about the requirements of the job. Quote, the position of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, while it's a political appointment, is not a political job. It is a policy job, one that requires whoever is in the position to be nonpartisan. Well, Mr. President, given his judgment, given his temperament, I don't believe Dr. Kahl's lived up to his own assessment of what is required to serve in the Pentagon's 3rd most important defense role. I don't believe he has the qualifications for this position. There are plenty of good policy experts, Democrats, I'm sure, who do, and I would encourage my colleagues to vote against this nomination for these reasons. I yield the floor.